Hi, and welcome to the Lattes and Llamas Knitting Academy. Today, we're going to look at some advanced colorwork knitting techniques for knitting in the round. The first thing we'll look at is how to carry your colors in two separate hands. So traditionally, when I'm knitting, I'm either carrying my yarn in my left hand in continental technique or in my right hand in an English knitting technique. And one of the greatest things you can do for yourself as you learn colorwork knitting in the round is learn to actually use both techniques at the same time. So I'm going to carry one color in my left hand and one color in my right. If you remember from our beginners colorwork video, you're going to have a dominant color and a non-dominant color when you work in stranded colorwork. The difference between them is which one crosses over the top, right? So here I have a red yarn and I have a pale green yarn. My dominant color is going to be the green. That's the color that I want to pop a little bit more on the front side of my work. I want that to cross over the top of the red. If the red were my dominant color, I would want the red to cross over the top of the green. So because green will be my dominant, I'm going to carry that in my right hand, and my non-dominant color, the red, will be carried in my left hand. So for this technique, you're going to use both continental and English knitting at the same time, and I really recommend working a couple of rounds the first time you try this out, just going every other stitch. You don't need to overcomplicate it when you're learning a new technique. So let's take a look at how that works. I have my red, again, held in my left hand. Tension it however you're comfortable tensioning. I usually use my middle finger, and then the yarn comes out between my ring finger and my pinky. For the green yarn, I would typically knit in an English style, tensioning it the same way, like this. Because I'm working in magic loop, it would mean dropping my yarn to reposition my needles, and I'm a little too lazy for that, so I'm actually just going to pinch it and throw it like that. All right, so I'm going to work a red in continental, and then a green in English. And you'll see there, again, the green's coming over the top of the red as I work the stitch. That's my dominant color. If you're used to knitting in only continental or only English, this takes some getting used to, but you're going to wind up with much more even knitting once you do get adjusted to it, and it's really just a lot smoother and faster than carrying both yarns in one hand. So I'm just going to knit to the end of the round and let you watch the technique. You do want to be careful when you're using this technique to keep your dominant color consistent. Typically, that's always going to be the color in your right hand. So anytime you put down your project and come back to it, you always just want to take a moment to think about which color is the dominant color and which is the non-dominant before you pick up your yarn. It's very, very easy to pick it up and switch which yarn is in which hand, and that'll switch the dominance. Right, and you see how nice and even It makes my floats behind the yarn or behind the work. So that's the basics of carrying your yarn in two hands. So now let's take a look at the next strategy you're going to want to deal with, which is easier when your yarns are in two separate hands, and that's catching your floats in between long stretches of a single color. So the traditional wisdom is that you're going to catch your floats anytime you work more than 5 stitches of one color or more than 1 inch worth of knitting. The 1 inch really only comes up for me if I'm knitting on very large yarn and large needles. If I was on worsted weight in, say, US 8 or larger, then that 1 inch might possibly be fewer than 5 stitches, but it's pretty rare for that to be fewer than 5 for me, so I just go with the 5 stitch rule. So let me show you what that looks like in practice. Here, I'm going to work 7 stitches and I'm not going to catch my float. So let's say my pattern called for 7 red stitches and 1 green. So let's take a look at that. I've got these really long floats here on the back of my work. They're not problematic inherently, but it would be very, very easy to give this green yarn just a little too much tension and suddenly have my float shrink up. And now my work can't stretch. It's all squished together. It would also be very, very easy to catch. If this were going to be a sock, if I'm putting my foot in this, imagine how easy it is to catch your toes on this and pull stitches out of your work or just otherwise frustrate your morning. That's not what you want. So I'm going to go around the second half of this round, and this time I'm going to catch that green float halfway through the 7 stitches. So I'm going to work the same thing, 7 stitches of red and 1 of green, but I'm going to catch my green at the center. So that's going to be stitch 4. So I'll work 1, 2, 3 stitches of the red. Now before I work this 4th stitch, I want to go ahead and catch my yarn there. There's a couple of ways to do it, but my favorite way, when I'm doing the long float with my dominant yarn, so that one's in my right hand, I'm going to put it as if I were going to knit. I'm not going to knit this stitch. I'm just throwing it like I was going to, but then I'm going to stop and go ahead and grab the stitch with the red and take my green back off. Now when I complete that red stitch, my green gets trapped between the fabric and my yarns. So I'll work the next 3 stitches, right? So now I've got my 7 reds. And when I go to work my green, now my float is only working across 4 of those stitches. Well, 3.5 really, because it catches on the 4th. So I'll do that again. 1, 2, 3. Now I'm going to catch it. I throw my yarn as if to knit, but I don't knit the stitch. I pick that red stitch and I take the green over the red and back off my needle before completing the stitch. Once you get used to doing it, it really goes pretty quickly. So here, I'm not even going to work any green stitches. I'm just going to work red all the way to the end so you can see that float. There's going to be patterns that ask you to work many, many stitches of a single color before using the next one. You still want to carry that color across the round, but imagine if you were asked to work 15 stitches before the green, right? You definitely wouldn't want a giant float on the inside of your work. So now we can take a look at it and look at these floats compared to these guys. Right? It's much cleaner and it doesn't show on the right side of my work. So now let's do the same thing, but let's say I want to work several stitches with my dominant color and catch my non-dominant. All right, so here I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to work 7 stitches of green and then 1 stitch of red. So following that same methodology, I'm going to work 3 of my green stitches. Now I'm going to do much the same. I'm going to go as if I were catching that red yarn, but I'm not going to work the stitch, right? So I'm treating it like I'm going to knit the stitch, but I don't complete it. I throw my dominant color and I bring that red back off. So again, you always want it coming up and over the top of the needle when you bring it off, and then I complete the stitch with the green. Now I work that red stitch, and just like with the green yarn, my floats get caught. So let's do a couple more of those. So I'm doing 3 stitches of my green. Now I'm going to catch the red. I put it over the needle, almost as if I were working a stitch. If I were working the stitch, I'd be coming up under it like that, but I'm just placing it on the top of the needle, throwing my yarn, and then taking it back off and completing the stitch. All right, so let's take a look at those floats. Go to the wrong side of my work. And I see that just like when I did the same thing with the green, because it's my non-dominant color, it's a little less clear, but my floats are in there. So float, 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 nice and neat. One more consideration you're going to want to take into account when using this technique is that if you're catching floats multiple rounds in a row, you're going to want to scatter those catches so it doesn't create a little blip on the front of the work. You don't see it here because I haven't worked a ton of rows. But if I worked many rows where I was working the catch on every 4th stitch, it would create a little bit of a blip on the front of my fabric, and I don't want to have that. So instead, I'm going to scatter it. So what I'll do is I'll remember that, well, on this row before, or on this round before, I caught it every 4th stitch, right? So I worked 3 stitches, caught my yarn, worked 3 stitches, and then worked the other color. I'm going to just choose a different cadence every other row so that I don't wind up with all of my catches on the same stitch, because it'll create a little ridge in your work. So since I'm going to stick with my working 7 stitches in green and then 1 in red, but this time, instead of catching it on the 4th stitch, I'm going to catch it on the 5th stitch. I sometimes, skipping 7 stitches is a fairly common number to skip, so sometimes I might even catch it twice. I might catch it on the 2nd stitch and then again on the 5th. And it just scatters where I'm catching the yarn. So here you can see my 2 little tiny floats from catching it on the 2nd stitch and the 5th stitch, my 1 slightly longer float from catching it on the 4th stitch, and it just scatters where that catch is at, so it distributes that evenly across your fabric. So I recommend making a swatch and just giving that a little bit of a practice. I think that once you get used to it, you'll really enjoy it. When I'm not making a video and I'm just kind of doing my thing, I can really fly pretty fast working it this way. So here, I'm doing that same thing I did before, where I'm not even going to work any of my green stitches. I'm just going to catch it behind, but I'm making sure to catch it on a different stitch than I did on the row prior. And I wind up with floats that have enough slack to give my fabric some stretch, but they're not so large that I'm too worried about catching my toes on them. And you'll find the catching kind of cadence that works for you. So like I said, traditionally, you would never do more than 5 stitches without catching. There's certainly knitters that don't like to do more than 3 because they want to keep those floats nice and tidy and close to the fabric. Just play around with it, see what works for you. And I'll see you next time at the Lattes and Llamas Academy.